They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to the latest episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
I'm Katie Gorka.
And what an exciting week it is for us. First of all, we are coming to you on the backdrop of Memorial Day weekend, which is a weekend, yes, to unofficially start summer, and yes, to have barbecues and time with your family, but it's also a weekend to really think back and pay tribute to the people, the men, the women who wear our uniform, who do so and give up their lives to protect our freedom and to protect our great nation and to make us really what we are today. And I know, Katie, that is not lost on you. It's certainly not lost on me. This is definitely the reason, what we should be thinking about every day of the year, but certainly on Memorial Day. And I know before we bring in our guest, which I'm very excited about, you actually took part in Memorial Day services this year, right? In a ceremony?
Yes, I did. I usually do. I usually try to, and I'm really blessed because here in Northern Virginia, we have services going on in virtually every small community around us. So I tend to go to the one out in Great Falls. It's run by Andy Wilson. They just do a terrific job. There's a memorial there. They do a whole service. It's beautiful. The Boy Scouts come out. They take part. And I just want to say Andy does an incredible job of really kind of reminding us of what our soldiers have done for us and why we have this day and why it's so important for us to hand this on, this memory, this knowledge to our children. So it was a very special and beautiful day. It was a moving day.
The Boy Scouts are such a huge part of it. In Los Angeles, I think they put out something like 90,000 flags in cemeteries in LA, which is incredibly beautiful to see. We've got some presidential libraries as well. Both the Nixon and the Reagan do amazing things for Memorial Day. So we hope you had a good Memorial Day, of course, but also took some time to say thank you, to say a prayer for the families who are not whole because of the brave men and women who have made us who we are today. Now, one of those great men is joining us today. And I want to say the distinction of being our first male guest on the Happy Women Podcast. So this is going in the record books as our first male victim here on the Happy Women. Former Secretary of Veterans Affairs for President Trump, the Trump administration, Robert Wilkie is here. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I accept the honor.
This is now you're in the Hall of Fame, the Happy Women Hall of Fame, which we're so excited about. Now, I know you're also at the America First Policy Institute. We talk a lot about the great work they do, but Katie knows how I like to start this off. And I like to start it off with figuring out how you, Secretary Robert Wilkie, got to where you are today. Tell us a little bit about your backstory, the things that people may not know.
Well, I think the most important part of my life, aside from my wife and children, was the fact that I grew up at Fort Bragg and Fort Sill. My father was an airborne ranger. I grew up amongst the most decorated soldiers in all of the armed services. He was a senior officer in the 82nd Airborne Division, and I really came of age watching and listening. Many generations of service. You can't see the pictures behind me, but great-grandfather, grandfather. I'm actually the black sheep in the family. I'm the first Wilkie male since the war with Mexico who was not an artillery officer. I'm wearing the rondelle of the United States Air Force on my lapel. But separate and apart from that, I was also blessed to learn from some of America's greatest leaders. I came into this business with the great Jesse Helms. Then I moved to the White House with Condi Rice and Steve Hadley, and then on to Don Rumsfeld and Bob Gates. I've spent almost my entire life in and around the military. As I mentioned, I was born in khaki diapers. Very proud of that. And it has colored everything that I do. Prior to becoming VA Secretary, I was actually Undersecretary of Defense for Readiness. And I'll do this math problem. It gives you an idea of the size of the Department of Defense. At VA, I was the head of the second largest department in government, 400,000 employees, $250 billion budget. As the Undersecretary of Defense, I had 700,000 civilian employees, 2.1 million under arms, and a budget of over $300 billion. And I was just the Undersecretary of Defense. But the most important, I'll finish with this because it colors what we'll probably talk about today. I was a youngster when the hostages were taken in Tehran. My father at the time was the operations chief for 18th Airborne Corps, which was the umbrella headquarters for both the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne. Our neighbor across the street was taken hostage. It's a colonel. He was just in Tehran on temporary duty. And within a few weeks of the hostages being taken, now this is the depths of the Jimmy Carter era, a massive billboard went up outside of Fort Bragg looking at the post, and it said, "Iran, let our people go." Now, I may have been a youngster going to high school, but that billboard left an indelible impression with me because it was facing the most decorated of all American combat units, the 82nd Airborne. And that's what we had become, someone begging the theocratic fanatics in Tehran to let our people go. And that week that it went up, I think I was in the crowd at a junior varsity football game. And they had my history teachers in front of me. And I remember one of them, after the hostages were taken, saying, "Anybody who wants us can have us." That's how low we had gotten under Jimmy Carter. I will make the argument that we're in much sadder shape now with Joe Biden and his blundering national security team than we ever were with Mr. Carter, because there's a distinct difference. Separate and apart from the fact that Mr. Carter should not have been president. He was not competent to lead the nation. But Jimmy Carter liked America. He loved America. We have a group of people in charge now who believe that we are responsible for all of the problems in the world, which is why, and I'll leave with this last anecdote, we have a Secretary of State who in his first 2 months in office hosted the Chinese foreign minister on American soil in Alaska. And at the opening of the meeting, the Chinese minister read back a series of indictments against American society as racist, as imperialist, as oppressive, all taken from Joe Biden's speeches. And the only thing our Secretary of State could say is that we have to do better. Now, had that been Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, or Richard Nixon, the response would have been, the United States of America will not be lectured by a country that has murdered 100 million of its own people since 1949. But that's the great conundrum that we face now. And we just have to pray that the next few months go by quickly without any more damage being done.
Secretary Wilkie, President Donald Trump asked you to serve in his administration. Real turnaround there. Tell us about that experience.
Well, it was fascinating. First of all, I was very happy at the Pentagon. That had been my life. And when I got this call, I'd never been a doctor and never played one on television. And I was given some pretty clear orders to clean it up. I was given emergency powers to do that. And I began by doing some very fundamental things, by removing the unions from our buildings, by putting in place people who either came from uniform or came from military families, because I felt that the downside of VA's history, at least since Reagan made it a cabinet department, or Bush did, was that people were going to VA to get a fancy secretary title on their resumes. I needed people who'd been in the system, who knew the life, who knew the language. The other thing that I did was bring in military principles of organization. I cleaned up the records department. They were 4 years behind on their mail system. I brought in Air Force personnel to run it. I computerized the appeals process. So the appeals decisions went from years to a couple of days. I got rid of employees who were not doing their job or living up to their oaths. And the other thing that I did is simple military leadership, and that is walk the post. You would be amazed at stories like this next one, where I showed up at the Audie Murphy Veterans Affairs Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, the 10th largest hospital, 10th largest city in the country. And the response that I got from the people there was, "Sir, you're the first secretary we've ever seen."
Well,
And I tried to get our people out. And as a result of that, when the epidemic hit, we were ready. In fact, we were so ready that we actually sent 3,000 VA employees into the civilian sector, particularly places like Indian country out west, to take care of patients, many of whom were not even veterans. So when President Trump came to office, VA had a 37% approval rating, according to the Clinton News Network. When we left, it was at 91%. We'd set a record for the number of appointments VA took in, 49 million. But we also set a record for sending the most veterans into the private sector, and getting them out of government-run healthcare, and also modernizing systems. The VA was very much a 19th century brick and mortar institution. And we tried to drag it into the last half of the 20th century. And we would worry about the first half of the 21st century and the second Trump administration. But it's not rocket science. It's leadership and also the ability to make decisions and not worry what the Washington Post says. I was taught by Senator Helms a long time ago that today's Washington Post lines tomorrow's bird cages. And that's exactly how you look at it. And the statistic that I use about how they cover things is that they ran more stories on VA per month than they have run on VA in almost 4 years of Joe Biden. I'll give you another example.
Embarrassing and frustrating, unfortunately.
Yeah, one other example of just the outright hatred and incompetence of the mainstream media. If I didn't have anything on my official schedule, they would just descend. Where is he? Why isn't he doing his job? And I visited every state, plus all of our territories, including our protectorates out in the Pacific, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Palau, the Northern Marianas. This is an administration where the Secretary of Defense can disappear for 10 days and nobody knows or cares. The Secretary of Transportation goes away for 2 months in the middle of a logistics nationwide emergency. The Washington Post is silent in 7 languages. So, the one thing I learned from the president, and I also learned this from Senator Helms in particular, is that you really have to do everything in your power to ignore the outside pressures and just get on with doing what's right. And I think the results at VA speak for themselves.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think President Trump was probably, I think is the most underrated president probably in history. I mean, in my lifetime, he achieved more in 4 years than anybody that I can remember. And that was under constant scrutiny, under constant drama, impeachment, and all of this. And yes, I think a lot of people are now giving him more credit on what he did from a national security perspective and from the border, certainly on the economy. But I've been saying for a long time, I think some of his greatest achievements are the ones they don't even talk about. That's Right to Try. That's his war on drugs, where he was really starting to get some success and traction on overdoses in this country. And certainly with the VA, and that's with your help as well, Secretary Wilkie. So what do you think is probably the best accomplishment that you had during your time at the VA, and what still needs work? Obviously under Biden, a lot needs work, but what still needs our attention today?
Well, this is a symbiotic achievement. Morale went sky high.
Sure.
President Trump inherited a VA that was ranked dead last in terms of best places in government to work. And when he left, it was number 5. It had moved up, 13, 14 categories. And that was reflected in the record number of appointments as people came back into the VA because their appointments were on time. They got to see living, breathing doctors. And if we could not provide what they needed, we made sure that the private sector was available to them. And we made sure that their interests were the most important thing to the case, as opposed to what the bureaucracy demands. And on top of that, by getting rid of those 8,000 people, we sent a message not only to the patients, but also to those employed at VA that, 1, the standards are high. 2, we're not going to force good employees to carry the weight for bad employees. And once those people started to go away, we noticed that the morale in the workforce skyrocketed. It's back to where it was under Obama, sadly. It's another union-dominated victim fest run by people who have no military experience. And we see that they stopped taking polls as to how they're doing. They pulled out of the Partnership for Public Service, which did that survey on best places to work. That was a nonpartisan think tank. They stopped that. And you just see scandal after scandal now at this VA. But the Washington Post and the New York Times are silent in 7 languages.
I have to say, during my time as an appointee for Donald Trump at the Department of Homeland Security, I saw something very similar, and it was just shocking to me. There were people that were so abusive of the system, people who would maybe work 3 hours a day, and then there were other people that were working 14 hours a day, and yet everybody got treated the same. Right. Nobody got reprimanded. Nobody was called to task for...
Well, Katie, let me give you an example as to what's happened under Joe Biden. The VA just had its deputy secretary resign a few months ago and go back to Denver. The deputy secretary, the number 2, he came to Washington headquarters 1 day a month. 1 day a month.
Wow.
And then he was out in Denver the rest of the time doing Lord knows what. 80% of headquarters staff at VA doesn't even come into work. You could roll a bowling ball down the hallways and nobody's there. And if you look at what the Secretary of VA said on day 1, these were his priorities: DEI, transgender rights, union prerogative, and remote work. One word is missing from each one of those prerogatives, and that is the word veteran. They've turned it into another social justice petri dish, which is what they are doing to our armed forces as we speak.
So I wonder if you could go a little bit deeper into that. So we are all hearing the horrifying stories of, how the fact that the services aren't able to meet their recruiting goals. How are we going to turn that around? What do you see happening? And is it even fixable?
Well, it is fixable, but you need the right leadership. But let me give you 2 answers to an incredibly complicated question. The first answer is outside of Washington. We are raising generations of young people who are unfit physically, and they're unfit in terms of their education. They are not taught that the United States is the last best hope for man, that we have a system worth defending, that we, as General Powell said, we have liberated more villages, towns, and countries than any nation in the history of the world. And the only thing we ask is for a place to bury our dead. And they are not taught the glories of our history. Because of that, you're seeing a shrinking pool of recruits just right off the bat. 60% of the officers come from 11 states, Virginia to Texas. And what we now see is a war on that part of the country. All of those are deep red states with the exception of Virginia. And what this administration is doing, and Katie, you and your husband would know this history, it's the same thing that the socialists in France did at the end of World War I. They spent almost 20 years purging the military of Catholics and conservatives in the name of radical reform. And what happened when the Germans came across the border? The French army melted away because instead of professionals who represented a great martial tradition, the French army was staffed by officers who were there because their political profile fit the preferences of the powers that be in Paris. What we're seeing now with the division of the army of our armed services into ethnic, racial, and sexual subgroups is a very attack on the military, the very meaning of the military and its ethos. We have a Secretary of the Army who says, and she has said it more than once, that she does not want second and third generation recruits in the armed forces. People like me, people like John McCain, people like Douglas MacArthur, because she argues that that is at war with diversity. This is the same Secretary of the Army who says you can pass the Army physical fitness test with 10 push-ups and 2 miles in 25 minutes because anything harder than that discourages underrepresented groups. The war against the military is one of the great goals of the American left, to destroy it as an institution, to destroy the individuals who would normally join the armed forces. And the reason we're seeing those numbers go down, I just swore in 172 young high schoolers down in Fayetteville, North Carolina, right outside of Fort Bragg. I don't call it Fort Liberty, it is Fort Bragg. And for the first time in my life, I heard families representing generations of service saying they're really having second thoughts about sending their children to the Biden Pentagon.
How could you not?
Yeah, I don't have it here. I'd have to bend down and it'd be a bad picture. But I actually have the document signed by the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who says he only wants 43% white pilots in the armed forces. He signed it. So did the Secretary of the Air Force. You know, the great thing about the military is the same thing you find in professional sports. If you perform, you're accepted. It doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. These people are at war with that. And they're at war with that at a time when I can argue that the world is much more dangerous than it was when the sclerotic Soviet Union was on the other side of the wall.
Let's talk about that, because I think if you are a sane person, you probably have to think twice about joining armed services in our country with Joe Biden at the helm and with the people that he brings with them. If you saw Afghanistan, if you look around at how he is flip-flopped all over the place when it comes to Israel and the Middle East, and really, quite frankly, the whole reason that there is a Russia and Ukraine is because of his drilling policies. We set up Russia and gave them the ability to go in Ukraine. I guarantee you, Secretary Wilkie, and I know you'd agree as well, that if President Trump were still in the White House, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now, but we are. And so you were the the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Preparedness. How prepared are we? And are we? I mean, there are a lot of hot spots right now around the globe that should concern us.
You mentioned Afghanistan. Look, our troops are being shot at as we speak by a bunch of Houthi ragtag brigands supported by the Iranian mullahs. And this administration doesn't fire back. they've managed to take control of the world's second busiest waterways. So what happened when Putin got out of his box against Trump? Something very simple. Putin was told, you keep your troops away from ours in the Syrian desert, or else. He didn't listen. And the next thing, 300 of his little green men disappeared in a red mist. And he went back in his box. The same thing happened with the Ayatollahs. They got too cute in the Syrian desert and started firing rockets at American encampments. The next thing that they knew, the number one brain, the number one planner, the great mind behind international terrorism disappeared after a rocket hit his plane on an Iraqi runway. The mullahs were in their box. The Russians, the Iranians move when Democrats are in charge. That's plain and simple. You can't refute that. Putin grabbed almost a third of Ukraine under Obama. The Ayatollahs tightened their grip in areas of the Middle East outside their country under Obama-Biden. The Chinese were much bolder under Obama-Biden than they ever would dare under Trump. And the little Kim, the little rocket man, was back in his hole in Pyongyang just waiting for Trump to go away. What this administration has done with its blundering, it has humiliated the United States on the world stage. And not only that, it has led our allies to question whether or not we can ever be trusted. And I'll give you an example. And I joke that the mainstream media said that when we left office, the professionals would be in charge. Well, the last time they talked about the best and the brightest, 56,000 names went up on a Vietnam Wall. These are the inheritors of that mindset, a very cloistered, and I say Ivy League way of thinking that these people can move the world with their words, and not only their words, but their actual contempt for the United States. Give you an example. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, called the entire nation of Japan xenophobic 2 weeks ago. We have no more loyal ally on the planet than Japan. And then if that wasn't enough, he turned around the next day and said something about India, soon to be the world's largest country, and a country that's vital if the United States is going to contain Chinese aggression. So what's happening now is the Chinese, the Russians, the mullahs are going to countries like the Philippines, countries like Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and said, look, Joe Biden just threw over the side America's two closest historical and spiritual allies, the United Kingdom and Israel. What do you think he's going to do to you? And you don't even have those kind of relationships that Great Britain and Israel have with the United States. That is Jimmy Carter on steroids, but Jimmy Carter colored by a contempt for the American way of life.
I have to say this time does feel shockingly like 1979, but I'm hopeful about the fall. If President Trump is reelected, how hard do you think it'll be to turn this around, and what's it going to take?
Well, on the budgetary front, it's not going to take much. Right now, and if Joe Biden were reelected, we would be on a trajectory to spend 2% of our GDP on the military. That's not been done since the presidency of William Howard Taft. That tells you how bad things are. So I would see an immediate restoration of robust defense spending, the elimination of all the social justice programs that have been implemented, and really get to turn the ship around, just as Ronald Reagan did. On the international front, the same warnings that went out to the Russians and the Ayatollahs and the Chinese and the North Koreans when Trump was in power would come back to the fore. And this time they actually have proof of what he would do in the event that they got out of line. I've just been in Eastern Europe the countries on the front line against Putin are praying for Trump to come back. They have been ignored by the professionals. I always go back to that. The professionals are in charge. I've heard from prime ministers of countries in Eastern Europe who can't even get a meeting with staff at the National Security Council. Donald Trump would meet with the chairman of the Albanian Youth Commentary on sports. If that individual wanted to meet with the president of the United States. And that kind of personal diplomacy was very, very important. We've never seen anything like this. And it was capped off, Jen and Katie, just a week ago when the representative of the United States at the United Nations stood in reverent silence over the death of one of the great killers in the post-World War II era, the gratefully dead president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a man who just in one single day signed a death warrant for 5,000 people without trial. But that's who we are responding to, throwing our friends over the side and appeasing the world's bloodiest tyrants.
And the people who hate us most on the planet.
It's what I call faculty lounge lunacy.
That's right. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Sometimes it feels like we're living in an alternate universe because it just doesn't make any sense. Robert Wilkie is with us, former Secretary of Veterans Affairs under the Trump administration, a long legacy of service to the country. Right now, you are working for the America First Policy Institute. I want to give you a few seconds before we run out of time today to talk about that, because we just had Melissa Melendez on, who is in charge of the California chapter of AFPI. She's fabulous.
AFPI is a wonderful organization. It was created by Linda McMahon, who was in the Trump cabinet, one of America's great entrepreneurs, and Brooke Rollins, who gave us the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and then moved to the White House to be President Trump's head of domestic policy. They had a transformational view of what a think tank should be, not just academic, but a practical think tank in the sense that you get people who have been in charge and you translate that experience along with heavy research and put in train policy changes and policy recommendations that can inform the next Republican conservative White House. We have cabinet secretaries, we have governors, some of the most famous members of the conservative movement in our country who are part of AFPI. You all know the people like, Larry Kudlow, Bobby Jindal. Those are the kind of people, Rick Perry, who have played a very important part in the transformation that took place under Donald Trump and what we hope will occur again. Our job is to be prepared when those election results are announced. And
3 weeks after Election Day. Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. We're not going to go through what we did last time.
No.
And I think what you've seen with the president, especially something as simple as the change of the guard at the RNC, you've put in place people who will have that institution ready to go. Unlike the last time where they were fighting and kicking the notion against the notion of Donald Trump being the nominee. They didn't want to listen to the voice of the Republican electorate. And I think as a result of that, the transition never really got off the ground. It wasn't President Trump's fault. That's not going to happen this time. This time, we will be ready and we will strike on many fronts. And I'll leave it at that because I won't give the other side the advantage of knowing what those fronts will look like. But AFBI is doing a magnificent job. And I would say our executive director is the great Chad Wolf, who did such great things at DHS, and is one of those public servants like Clarence Thomas and Amy Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh, and now Justice Alito, who have had to survive the not only the rhetorical attacks by the left, but actual the attempts at physical intimidation. The left is about violence. It's not Donald Trump and that one day in January 6th. People forget that the day the man was inaugurated, half of Washington, D.C. burned down. And that has been the tradition of the left really since the French Revolution. It accelerated under the Bolsheviks, and then the student Marxists took it to new heights in the 1960s, and now we're witnessing their progeny, both in the classroom and on the classroom quads. And unlike the past, they've now taken over one major American political party. And that's the great tragedy. The notion that the Democratic Party and particularly the president and the leader of the United States Senate would get into the Hamas protection business and condemn a nation our civilization was born in the Judean desert, and to abandon them to the wolves. I can't think, even with the Iranian hostages, of a lower point in American diplomacy, American foreign policy than that. And there's probably more to come before the election.
Yeah, it's true and unfortunate.
Jen, I'll leave you with one. There is hope. Not only the people that I described, but I'll leave you with one quote from one of the great masters of statecraft, the Iron Chancellor Bismarck. And I think Katie has heard me say this before. Bismarck had been thrown over the side by another clown in power, Kaiser William, who thought he was so smart that he didn't need the greatest diplomat, practitioner of the dark arts of politics that Bismarck was at that time. And then when he did it, Bismarck agreed to give an interview to Winston Churchill's grandfather, who happened to own the New York Times at the time. And he was asked, well, Chancellor, what do you see for the coming 20th century? And he rocked back in his chair. He said two things. First of all, the North Americans speak English, which means Germany would never get out of the shadow of the British and then the American nation. And second, he said, as a Lutheran, I've come to appreciate that the Almighty does three things with his power. He protects fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. And that has stuck with me. From all people, Bismarck. And no, we will overcome this, but it's going to need an effort, not so much from the top down, but from the ground up in our school boards and our county boards and city councils to really stop this rot. Because if we don't work, then the rest of the world goes away.
Amen to that.
We talk about that personal responsibility all the time. You can't just sit and watch the game anymore. We all have to be active participants. That's for sure. For too long, conservatives were asleep, and now we have to wake up and get busy.
That's right.
And what a pleasure it was to talk with you. You know what? I'm not even going to hold against you that you're not a Dodger fan like I am, Secretary Wilkie. When we first met, what was that?
Well, look, I went to Woke Forest University. Where the football dorm is named after Arnold Palmer, which ought to tell you something right there. So.
There you go. So thank you so much for being with us. I would love to have you back again. So much great information.
Anytime.
Former United States Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Robert Wilkie, now with the America First Policy Institute. Secretary Wilkie, thank you for your service to our country and for leading us still, keeping us reminded that we all need to be active participants in this game of politics to save our country. So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Another episode of Happy Women. Please tell your friends about us. Give us a 5-star review. Share us. Subscribe at SalemPodcastNetwork.com and check out Katie Gorka online, katiegorka.org. Her book, Next Gen Marxism, is out right now. You should have it.
It's on the show.
You'll see behind Secretary Wilkie. He's your Vanna White, Katie. This is so exciting.
Thank you, Secretary Wilkie, for coming on. This has been great.
And
you.
you can follow
Thank
me
you.
as well on Instagram, Jennifer Horn Radio on Instagram, on Facebook, Jennifer Horn on Truth and X. And we will talk to you next time on the Happy Women Podcast.